Okay. Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is the first day back at Queen's Park for us since the momentous events of last week. But to bring things back to Ontario for a minute, what I'm doing today, either today or tomorrow at the latest, is tabling a bill that will take the OMB out of the Toronto planning process. This is not the first time. In fact, this is the third time that this bill will be introduced. The first time Rosario Marchese did it. I then introduced the second bill, and now this will be the third time we're going at this. Certainly it has the support of Toronto in the past. I think it was voted, they voted in favor of getting Toronto out of the OMB, about 34-5. Mississauga was unanimous. So there's a general will on the part of our municipalities to make changes. And it's timely because right now the province, as we know, is undergoing a review of the way the OMB works. And to speak about this, I have two of the best from City Council. I have Mike Layton on my right, but not really, and Joe Cressy on my left, but definitely. Wards 19 and Wards 20. And they're going to speak about how this bill and getting Toronto out of the OMB would impact them. So, Joe, take it away.
Sure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Ontario Municipal Board is unelected, it's undemocratic, and it's unaccountable, and it needs to be abolished, and in Toronto we need to be freed of its jurisdiction. The Ontario Municipal Board removes planning from local neighborhoods and local governments. And I have to tell you, in Ward 20, where I represent in downtown Toronto, I have 1/4 of all proposed development in the entire city. And in downtown Toronto, in line with the province's Planning to Grow Act, we support intensification. But we support intensification when it allows us to build neighborhoods, not just add density. The OMB prevents us from building neighborhoods, from supporting intensification that allows for an equitable, sustainable, and well-managed city. In my ward, in Ward 20, I have 25 current appeals in front of the Ontario Municipal Board. 25. That totals more than 1,000 stories of development. In fact, that's 5.5 CN Towers worth of development under appeal in my ward in front of the Ontario Municipal Board. 2 weeks ago, 122 to 128 Peter Street, I hosted a public meeting to review an application. We had 200 residents and property owners and business owners come out to review an application. We had 6 city staff who came out in the evening to review an application. A developer walked in, stood in front of the room and said, "This application is now under appeal at the OMB." The meeting ended. That is unacceptable, and it was an insult to the residents and business owners of our city. And so the City of Toronto in 2008 and 2011, we voted for the province to abolish the OMB. The province did not. In 2012, we voted overwhelmingly as a city to ask the province to let Toronto out of the jurisdiction of the OMB. The province did not. In the meantime, neighborhoods are suffering, our city is suffering, and we have a province that has been reviewing, a government that has been reviewing the OMB since 2003. Enough of the studies, enough of the reviews, enough of the commissions. We have a bill that will be tabled that, if it voted on by this government, would support the City of Toronto. The province of Ontario, the government of Ontario, should listen to Torontonians and support Cheri DiNovo's bill.
Thank you, Joe. Mike.
Well, thank you very much, Cheri. The issue isn't just decisions at the board. It's how we go about making decisions as a city in order to avoid decisions at the board. Far too often, city planners are forced to make decisions that are in fact against the interest of the city because of the worst outcome that we could achieve or we would have to settle for at the Ontario Municipal Board. Just this past council meeting, we settled on an item in the community that I represent down in the Fort York neighborhood that took additional density and height irrespective of the or irregardless of the impact on one of Canada's most historic sites, the historic Fort York, because of the potential for even additional height that we would have had to settle with from the board. And this was not about whether or not we should accommodate density or not. There was already a lot of density being proposed on the site that the city was willing to accept. Unfortunately, though, because of the likelihood of a positive decision from the unaccountable, unelected Ontario Municipal Board, we would have ended up, or likely would have ended up, in a worse result at the end of the day. When we think about the bodies that help us make decisions on the municipal level and at the provincial level, we need them to be accessible to people. When you have the Ontario Municipal Board and the price of entry, the credentials required to submit evidence at it, aren't accessible to most residents. And in fact, it can be quite a costly endeavor if a community or individuals wish to pursue a challenge at the board and in an effective way. What we need is Toronto and the elected officials of Toronto to be able to, in fact, make decisions over the final outcomes of these, what can be very significant impacts on neighborhoods. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. So just to sum up and maybe some background details, and this might surprise some, but the OMB was established over a century ago, and its original purpose was the management of railways between cities. It was never envisioned by the founders of the OMB that it would override municipal decisions, especially municipalities like Toronto that have large and well-versed planning departments that are quite capable of making their own decisions and having their own appeal process. If anybody's ever been to an OMB hearing, this is what they're likely to see. On one side, they'll see, and I've been to a number, on one side they'll see the developers. The developers will have lawyers, and they're well-paid lawyers because developers tend to have some money. And sometimes they'll even have planners that they've hired for the purposes of showing up that day. On the other side, you're going to get a group of citizens who took the day off work, if they could, who fundraised at bake sales to get some money to be able to have any legal representation at all, who are standing up for their neighborhoods. That's an unfair fight. That's what OMB hearings look like. I've been to a number, as I've said, and guess who wins most of the time? The developer, of course. Now, this government has been looking at OMB review, as Joe said, since 2003. Whenever we've come close to reform of the OMB, guess what happens? It happened with Minister Jeffries back in the day. All of a sudden, you get a meeting, and in her case, there were some 400 developers and construction companies that came together that convinced her that the OMB should be taken out of the mix in terms of looking at land planning in the province of Ontario. We can't afford to have that happen again. I'm going to give you an example of something that just recently happened. This is last week. The OMB approved a high-rise development at 154 Front Street East, right in the area that made up the original town of York, what would later become, of course, the City of Toronto. The approved building was far higher than city planners had recommended. The OMB rejected the recommendations of city planners, the city's heritage expert, and the city's design review panel. The OMB ruled that since the city had allowed high-rise buildings nearby in the past, it was obliged to allow another. Jennifer Keesmaat had been promoting mid-rise development in the city, and indeed the mid-rises that already exist in the St. Lawrence area have been held up as models of denser but human-scale development. But the OMB ruling suggests that high-rises in the past compel the city to accept high-rises forever. So there's an instance. I mean, we all, and you heard of some, have instances in our areas. The overriding, for example, of Waterloo Region, although that's not covered by this book, in terms of the Greenbelt and allowing the Greenbelt to stay, that was another decision, again, by the OMB that overrode city and planners and the province's own best wishes for the area. So that's where we are right now. All the bill asks is that at this point, and quite frankly, needs to go to committee, as all bills do, and if people want to extend it, good, but its asks are modest, and that is just leave Toronto alone with the OMB. Toronto clearly has the infrastructure to decide its own fate, and as you've heard from both Mike and Joe, this is not an elected body. This is an appointed body. It's appointed by the government of the day, and it's appointed, one can assume, with some partisan interest. This should not be the case where major planning decisions are made. They should be decided by people that are democratically elected, that we can quite frankly, unelect if we don't like the decisions they make. There is no such appeal for voters or for democracy with the OMB. We have no say over who these people are, and we have no repeal process at all. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
So this is just for Toronto, not for Mississauga, which you mentioned is also...
This is for Toronto. I'm open to having this bill broadened, but I'm being practical. I've had a good track record, I think the best in terms of passing private members' bills in this province. So I'm being practical here. I'm putting forward a bill that I hope the government will get on side with, particularly at this time.
Do you think they will, though? They are undertaking their own review at this point.
Well, this is our contribution to that review, this bill.
And I would say, as a member of City Council, that there are 25 MPPs in the City of Toronto, 23 of whom are members of the current Liberal government. And the City of Toronto, councillors from east to west, north to south, and of every political stripe, have supported removing Toronto from the jurisdiction of the OMB. Residents from right across the city who vote for all political parties support removing Toronto from the OMB. So if the Toronto members of the legislature are listening to their constituents, then they should do the right thing and stand up for Toronto and support this bill.
Why is this the third time then? Why has it been so difficult to get some reform on this front?
That's a very good question, and I think deserves an answer from the government. I don't know what the answer is to that. Certainly you've heard the vast majority of people in Toronto want this to happen. Their councillors want it to happen, and their MPP should respect the councillors in the city and their own constituents on this issue. So hopefully this time we will get an answer. This is perfect timing for this bill again because the review is underway. So let's hope that part of the results of that review are to take Toronto out of the OMB, pass this bill, and make it so.
Is there no happy medium? I mean, we've been talking about the review for some time. You just want to see Toronto removed completely. There's no way that you could have there's no way that it could be designed that you want Toronto to be a part of it. I mean, what's the ideal?
Would you like to, Wayne?
Well, I think we've had an opportunity to review this process for years, and we haven't taken that opportunity. The City of Toronto is an enormous planning apparatus that has a deep expertise and whose policies are often then copied by other municipalities in Ontario and across North America. Why would we then continue to participate in a review process that has no accountability to the residents of the City of Toronto, or to or doesn't put that our planners' expertise and our policy objectives in front of those of the development industry? And to speak to the point earlier, why hasn't this moved any further forward? I suspect it's because of the enormous influence of the development industry on not only municipal politics but on provincial politics, and on the direction that the government takes with respect to the appeal body that essentially allows the development industry to hold something over the heads of municipalities as we're trying to make a decision. And once 6 months or the time frame for making a decision is up, many developers, I would say most developers, immediately assume that they're going to be going to the board.
So, big developers, or any developer seems to be winning at the board. Who is losing?
Well, the people of Toronto are losing with the Ontario Municipal Board, and that's clear. We are losing. The residents of Toronto are losing every single day. And they're losing because the Ontario Municipal Board, 50% of the time, rules against the local planning department and against local interests. And when there's a settlement, it's a settlement which is one that's not desirable for anybody. You're playing cards on a blackjack table and you're losing far too often. And so to the question of, is there a happy medium? You cannot make an undemocratic body more democratic. This body is unelected and undemocratic, and the answer is to rid and abolish the OMB.
My apologies for having you explain this like I'm a 2-year-old or something like that, but I think a lot of my listeners don't really know what the OMB is. Mm-hmm. So could you explain then how these decisions, how you can see them at an eye level? Because I think a lot of people, they'll see the signs go up, this development is proposed for such and such a block, and maybe that's as far as they think the decision goes. Maybe they don't know that there's a lot more involved than just the developer in the city in many cases.
Well, I can tell you in downtown Toronto, in my ward, my residents know what the Ontario municipal body is because it impacts them directly far too often. The process, to put it in very clear terms, is as follows. The province appoints 25 members to the Ontario Municipal Board. These are 25 individuals from across the province who don't necessarily have any knowledge or concept of the local circumstance where they are making decisions. Developers put in an application, as is their right, to rezone land. I could put in an application to rezone your house wherever you live for 100 stories. That doesn't mean I can build it. The planning department reviews it, as does the local municipality. And we can say no. But that developer can simply appeal our decision to the Ontario Municipal Board. That's what they do, and the OMB makes a decision. And far too often we have members of the OMB who don't have any concept for what works for Toronto making decisions against the interest of you and your household.
And again, the trial process, as I pointed out, is critically unfair. You've got one side with all the resources and the other side with very few, going up against a panel of folk who, as we've said time and again, are unelected, and those who are being decided about, and projects being decided about, have no say about their election or no say about their repeal or their job in any sense. There are political appointments, with all that go with political appointments. And part of what doesn't go with political appointments is being able to say yay or nay to their resumes. The fact that they may have planning backgrounds or not, or persuasions in one direction or another, or be developers or not. I mean, none of that is transparent, and none of that is open to scrutiny or, again, to repeal by voters the way councillors are, or the way we are as MPPs. And just to the point about, is there a halfway measure? Could we reform the OMB? Maybe, I can't imagine what that might look like. But the answer, I think, where Toronto's concerned for sure, is that there's already the infrastructure in Toronto. There's already planning department that know their stuff. If you want an appeal process, it can happen at the city level in Toronto. There may be, if there's an argument at all for the OMB, and I've heard many, it might be that in very small sort of rural municipalities, maybe that there are gatekeepers there, or democracy isn't alive and well in the planning process. Maybe the OMB, if it were elected, if it were transparent, might be able to play some kind of role, but certainly not in the city the size of Toronto. And again, this has been mirrored by residents and by their representatives who have been duly elected. I can say in my riding, and this is true right across the city, there have been many instances where we've gone to the OMB. Doesn't matter about political persuasion, all political bents are represented there on the one side, on the community side, against a developer over a development we didn't want. And sometimes we've been lucky, and most times we have not. And that's a real problem.
How do you give people more of a say in what happens with these planning and development decisions? Because I would contend, because I cover these stories all the time. I'll be in a neighborhood somewhere where there's a condo going up, or otherwise facing challenges of a growing city, and people will say, "Well, I don't understand why this is happening. There's no one out there advocating for my desire to have the neighborhood stay the way it is," for example. How do you give people more of or how do you get them more involved in these decisions and help them understand?
So one thing that I've had some experience with in Ward 19, and I know that Councillor Cressy has in Ward 20, is we go through and fine-tune the official plan in neighborhood by neighborhood, where we go in and look at a street, like in my case Queen Street or Bathurst Street, and we go through with the community and host through a series of workshops what we design the community we want to live in, and not just what the buildings look like, but the type of community we have. And often that then, with the help of planners and heritage consultants and people from our transportation division, help us paint a picture of what we need to build in order to achieve those things. And it doesn't mean no development. What it means is development that's appropriate across the neighborhood, not site by site. And if you are doing it site by site, then what you end up at the end of the day is a mishmash of planning principles. You don't end up with that holistic design that you can get if you look at the street as a blank canvas. Now, nothing is a blank canvas or will remain that way, but it allows us to set some limits and in fact give some feedback to developers in advance of them purchasing land or submitting applications, saying this is what the community is prepared to accept. But for it, you have to also give these things. So wider sidewalks, for instance, less or more parking, less or more bicycle parking. These are the types of things we work out in advance. Sadly, though, our staff are often actually away at board meetings and unable to complete that important work of that neighborhood by neighborhood planning that allows us to come up with reasonable ways of accommodating reasonable densities.
I just want to flesh that out and give you a concrete example. So it's easy to say no, it's much harder to say yes. So we proactively, as city councillors and in the planning department at the City of Toronto, work to establish a vision for a neighbourhood. So this week, Councillor Layton and I will vote on the Bathurst and Bloor Four Corners study. We have spent 2 years working with local residents, 4 residents associations. We've held 3 public meetings that have had more than 400 people come to the 3 of them on a comprehensive vision for the Bathurst and Bloor intersection. How tall should buildings be? How wide should the sidewalks be? Where should the park space be? How much light should be on Bloor Street during the day? We have spent 2.5 years developing that vision. We're going to pass that vision with resident involvement. But any property owner could simply appeal our 2.5-year process to the Ontario Municipal Board, and without any say, without any accountability, without any elections, without any resident engagement over 2.5 years, a provincially appointed member of the OMB could simply say, no, we disagree, goodbye. That is why this is unacceptable. That is how residents are made to feel worthless. So the City of Toronto, City Councillors, the Planning Department, we work with residents to set out a vision for how you say yes. And then the OMB shows up and says, no, it can be taller. That's the OMB.
But what about in cases, like if Toronto is removed from OMB oversight, there is an appeals process if people are still unhappy, if our residents are...
So what we have said, and as part of the bill that Cheri DiNovo is bringing forward, is that give Toronto the ability to have its own process. So we have something we've set up at the City of Toronto, which will be formed next year, called the Local Appeals Body, which is an appeals body set up by the City of Toronto to deal with minor variances, small development matters. We can do the same for rezonings and large development matters. But let us do it. We are the 6th biggest government in all of Canada. Our planning department is much bigger than whatever planning department the province has got. So why in the world wouldn't we be allowed to articulate our vision? We should be and we can.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Mike.